Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to our event. I'm Courtney. I'm a research fellow at LSE's Middle East Center. I'm also a non-resident fellow at Gulf International Forum, so it's good to bring the two worlds together, as well as three fantastic experts. So as you know, we're going to be talking a lot about kind of austerity and economic reform measures in the Gulf. Of course, these conversations about austerity and vision plans and all of this was ongoing all before the COVID-19 pandemic, and now all of these issues are being revisited. So a lot of questions are coming up about, whether the Rentier model is truly dead now. What's the future of expatriate labor? What's the future of the social contract in the Gulf? There's a lot of questions that our panelists, I'm sure, will answer today. So they're all going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So you'll just go ahead and you can type your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. Before we get started, I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers for those who don't know them already. So Dr. Dania Thafer is the Executive Director of Gulf International Forum. Her area of expertise is on the Gulf region's geopolitics, US Gulf relations, and the political economy of the GCC states. She's also a visiting scholar at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Dr. Thafer is currently writing a book focused on the effect of state-business relations on economic reform in the GCC, and she previously worked at the National Defense University's Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. Dr. Justin Gengler is Research Associate Professor at the Social and Economic Survey Research Institute, or CESRI, at Qatar University. He's a political scientist who works on political economy, political development, political behavior, public opinion, and survey methodology in the Middle East, particularly in the Arab Gulf states. He's the author of the fantastic book, Group Conflict and Political Mobilization in Bahrain and the Arab Gulf, Rethinking the Rentier State, which came out in 2015. And in fall of 2020, he's also a visiting associate professor at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Qatar. And he has lived and conducted fieldwork in Yemen, Bahrain, and Qatar since 2006. Dr. Steffen Hertog is Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His research interests include Gulf politics, Middle East political economy, political violence, and radicalization. His book, another fantastic read about Saudi state building, princes, brokers, and bureaucrats, oil and the state in Saudi Arabia, was published in 2011 by Cornell University Press and has guided a lot of research on this area since that time. He's also the co-author with Diego Gambetta of Engineers of Jihad, The Curious Connection Between Violent Extremism and Education, which was published in 2016 with Princeton University Press. So I'll go ahead and let them get started. We'll start with Dania Thafer.
Thank you, Doctor, for the introduction, and to London School of Economics for co-sponsoring this event. I would like to first begin by defining the social contract, since I think there are many people that may not know exactly what it means, and then addressing broad trends of GCC austerity measures and how they relate to the preservation of the social contract. The conceptualization of the Rentier social contract for the GCC states is one often debated, and you can read a lot about that in the literature. But it is generally defined as a tacit bargain that citizens exchange some political loyalty for a share of distributed rents from hydrocarbon wealth. And these distributed rents include a range of generous social benefits, subsidies, and an implicit clause of no direct taxation, if you will. The social contract of the Arab Gulf state is a deep-rooted systemic structure that is linked to the institutional design of an oil and gas economy, society, and the political environment of the Gulf states. And many discuss the social contract as it is some sort of switch that you can turn on or off. However, it's more fluid and adjusts with circumstances, in my opinion. And what are the primary transmission mechanisms of the social contract from the state to the society? Well, in the Gulf, it's a reliance on public sector jobs. Additionally, it includes free education and health and subsidized commodities. One often missed aspect of it is the kafala system. as having a large pool of non-citizens leaves a cushion of flexibility for the implementation of austerity measures that does not affect the social contract between the states and its nationals. And to illustrate the fluidity of the social contract, a key element of this is a tacit bargain that has changed from its original form is the subsidization of energy, which were considered by many as a pillar of the Gulf social contract. Energy subsidies were historically an important element of rent transfers, but has mainly been replaced by state-provided jobs. This mitigates the substantial opportunity cost associated with energy subsidies. However, public sector employment is very costly because it distorts the labor market. And as you know, there are demographic changes, and to a certain extent will contribute to the destabilization of the social contract as we know it, especially in the current dire economic circumstances. The Gulf states are and will be experiencing the largest increase in their national working age population. The formula of previous generations is just unsustainable, especially in states with lower levels of rentierism. And if this persists, will lead to high opportunity costs for diversification and productivity. The social contract should be reformed in a way that oil wealth is distributed through other mechanisms rather than public sector jobs. In order to ensure the stability in the future, the social contract with regard to the division of labor needs to be reformulated as the Gulf states' majority youth transition into the workforce. And perhaps now is actually an inflection point for those changes. I can't emphasize that enough. And if you follow my work, you've probably seen that in my research. Now, transitioning to an important question often posed, are the GCC states social contracts framed? Well, there's really no salient answer to this question, but I argue two key points. Each Gulf state social contract is in a different stage depending on its level of wealth and status of rentierism. And Gulf states in general have seized the opportunity of economic downturns to implement long overdue reforms, especially with regards to subsidies. However, these are carefully selected measures that still allow for the preservation of the core tenets of the social contract. Gulf states should not be viewed as monolithic with regards to their level of wealth and respective status of social contracts. One way to measure the disparity of wealth in the GCC states by using per capita as a proxy to capture wealth variability among the different states. For example, if you look at Qatar, you see, the last estimate per capita income is approximately 120,000, whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's almost half of that, around 67,000. That's a huge disparity. Both depend heavily on hydrocarbon wealth, yet vary greatly in their per capita wealth. So this translates in a difference in their respective social contracts. Generally speaking, I do separate the GCC states analytically by their level of rentierism or wealth. Higher levels of rentier states are like Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, and then you have the low-level classic ones, specifically Oman and Bahrain. They're a category in themselves. And then Saudi Arabia to a certain extent. Wealthier rentier states tend to have larger rates of expatriate workforce population. So that gives the state more opportunity in the current circumstances to shift the burden of austerity measures to the expatriate workforce. So states with lower levels of rentierism have a corresponding lower level or percentage of expatriates. So Saudi Arabia has 30%, which is the lowest level percentage-wise, and Bahrain is the highest from the less wealthy Gulf states at 55%. Oman is in between. For the higher or wealthier Gulf states, they have higher percentage of expatriates. In Kuwait, it's 70%. and it's at the highest in UAE at approximately 88%. So during times of austerity, wealthier states, expatriates will be the hardest hit, and to a lesser extent, the nationals. Whereas less wealthy states, since there's less flexibility to shift the burden on expats, you will likely see the social contract evolving at faster rates than the wealthier GCC states. Core elements of rentier states will be preserved, such as high levels of public sector employment and virtually no taxation, like direct taxation specifically. At least in the near term, I don't see those being instituted for especially the wealthier states. So expatriates will likely carry the burden of austerity. And to preserve the social contract, there will be a rise in nationalism of the workforces in the Gulf, replacing expatriates, especially in the public sectors. For example, Bahrain has announced plans to replace foreign workers in public schools with Bahraini teachers. The Saudi Ministry of Human Resource and Social Development announced in 9 major economic activities that the Saudization rate, which is the nationalization rate of the workforce, should be at 70%. Kuwait's Minister of Oil announced that the Qatar Petroleum Corporation and its subsidiaries will not hire expatriates for the rest of 2020 and 2021. Qatar has taken same measures. You probably have seen it in the news. There are other measures in which austerity measures could be implemented where they do not affect the social contract as well. For the best example of that is the post-2014 set of austerity measures. There could perhaps now be an inclusion of more fiscal measures in the form of fees and tariffs on goods and value-added taxes, while pointedly and methodically avoiding direct taxation on citizens. So you've seen, for example, the value-added taxes. You've seen the sin tax, the excise taxes, which was implemented in 4 of the GCC states, and 2 were to implement it actually this year. There are also less conspicuous measures applied, such as shifting fees on items not related to core aspects of the social contract. So after 2014, you saw, for example, different fees instituted by the government, like a postal service fees in Qatar, or fees on government services that were implemented largely in Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Bahrain. Airport fees for travelers that were implemented in Oman and UAE. Fees, and a large cluster of them on expatriates, especially in Saudi Arabia, but also in Kuwait and UAE. So we would be remiss really if we didn't discuss salaries of nationals, since that's an important aspect of the social contract. Social benefits such as allowances, which are granted to citizens during booms and then readjusted during busts, will likely remain a cyclical tool for the richer Gulf rentier states. The way salaries are allocated in the Gulf is there is a base and a set of bonuses and allowances. I suspect that bonuses and allowances will be slashed in many Gulf states, which can be a large part of their salaries, yet officially they are considered as a concession rather than an entitlement. So there is a cushion to play with the social contract there. Saudi started removing allowances. I expect other Gulf states to follow suit if they haven't already started. Oman and Bahrain, the 2 under immense economic pressure, will likely have more permanent measures. They will serve as testing grounds for other GCC states with regards to the social contract. They're very interesting cases to follow, and the transition to post-oil era, if you will. Another point I would like to add, when comparing the post-2014 crisis to today's crisis, I expect that these measures will be less coordinated among the GCC states After the 2014 economic downturn, there was a coordination among GCC states with regards to subsidies and other measures. However, the current rise of nationalism and less unity among the GCC states members, with the current rise of both of those, I suspect this time you will see less coordination among the GCC states and more measures that serve their own national interests. One big question mark lingering is the status of COVID-19. And there are many different projections about the status, and it is really beyond my scope to project this unprecedented, how this unprecedented event will be resolved. We live in very uncertain times. I think it is not a question of if, but more when will the virus become manageable. Then at that point, we can discuss or answer the big lingering issue of oil prices. My personal opinion is it is not the end of the oil era. The cyclical nature of the oil industry is one of boom and bust, and so consequently, prices will likely rebound in the long term. So to conclude, as the Gulf states, for the most part, continue to be addicted to the Rentier model, and it's very addicting when you get money easily. I mean, if any of you have ever gotten money very easily, it's hard to be very disciplined. The underlying aspects of the social contract will likely remain intact until oil runs out and or becomes obsolete. And depending on the duration of the COVID crisis, wealthier states will likely be able to stave off some of the effects of COVID-19 on the social contract and may survive this dual crisis. Less wealthy states with oil revenues diminishing, especially Bahrain and Oman, to a certain extent Saudi Arabia, but at a totally different scale, will have an accelerated track to re-evaluating their social contract. Arguments through the notion of no taxation without representation will affect the material legitimacy of Gulf monarchies anytime soon, in my opinion, are half-sided, and in my opinion, are slightly sensationalist. The idea that that democracy would suddenly emerge is, if the social contract changes, is, I think, untenable, excuse me. And the question that lingers is not if intrinsic aspects of the Rentier social contract will change, but really rather when. I mean, we know that nothing is just gonna stay constant. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Now we'll turn to Dr. Gengler.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you also, Dania, for the invitation to participate today. I'm going to share my screen because, as Courtney mentioned, I am a political scientist based at a survey research institute at Qatar University, and so I'm used to presenting results from quantitative studies. Hopefully that is working. As Courtney also mentioned at the beginning of this session, these are not new issues. And in my case, the results and thoughts that I'll be presenting today stem from the earlier crash in oil prices from 2014 and 15, rather than the most recent and even more dramatic drop, as you can see from the graph here. So the surveys that we conducted on issues related to the Rentier social contract were conducted at the nadir of oil prices in 2014 and 15, rather than the even further drop in 2020. And the idea behind this project is connected to what I do, which is survey research. If we want to understand how Gulf citizens prioritize the welfare benefits that they receive amid fiscal retrenchment, why don't we ask them? And that's kind of the motivation for this study. We know from Rentier state theory, decades of predictions, that people will oppose reductions in state distribution, but what benefits do citizens consider untouchable? What are the benefits that people would be more happy or willing to give up? And how do we explain the difference between those things that are seen as untouchable and those benefits and subsidies that are less prioritized? And finally, what do we know about how many people in Gulf states outright reject any type of fiscal austerity? And who is overrepresented among that group of people, and what might motivate their opposition to fiscal retrenchment? We have a few existing studies of attitudes towards fiscal reform, mostly in response to the 2014-2015 crash. Again, there are studies from Crane, for example, about the acceptance of electricity subsidy reform. From the Qatar context, we have a study about citizens' openness to reusing gray water as a way of saving money for the state. And Calvert-Jones' study in the UAE looks at survey data from students about state attempts to remold rentier mentality. But these existing data have some important limitations. Generally, they're focused on very specific policy measures, so something like electricity subsidies, rather than the broad, sweeping changes that we have seen since 2014 and now again in 2020. They tend to rely on responses to direct traditional survey questions rather than experimental methods that might give more reliable responses, since people might not want to give honest answers to sensitive questions on these topics. And finally, the data that exists are not very representative of either the Gulf region in general, since they focus on Saudi Arabia in the case of cross-national studies, or some of the other previous results are focused on the Qatar case specifically. So our idea was to try to go beyond these existing relatively limited survey data to conduct some experiments, not in the laboratory, but using a phone survey in Qatar among citizens, and asking people to choose in the same way that governments are asking people to choose implicitly, or they're deciding how to choose between different types of subsidies that they receive now, as well as different types of state spending. And then asked to imagine that the state were considering reallocating funding for these sectors or these subsidies, and asking them to prioritize one basket of subsidies over another basket. And the baskets consist of two items rather than one item. So rather than saying, would you rather have spending on education or health, the example would be, would you rather have spending on education and health or infrastructure and defense, for example? And the reason we did this is because some sectors or subsidies might be sensitive, and so asking about them directly would require respondents to reveal their preferences directly in ways that might introduce bias. In case of defense, for example, or involvement in regional crises. So this is what it looks like, an example of what a respondent, well, the respondent didn't see it because this is a phone survey, this is the screen of the interviewer, but it gives you the setup of the experiment, or the setup of this study, which is to pose this problem, which is that the state is running a budget deficit, and if it were going to have to make sacrifices, economic changes, as a result of this budget deficit, how would you as a citizen prioritize how it does that? And what you find when you run several rounds of this experiment in order to gain additional data with which to make estimates, that there's a very strong preference amongst citizens for spending on public services, core public services, health, education, and free electricity and water, rather than personalistic benefits, the things that we might think of as quintessential rentier patronage, very individualistic benefits received by the state for individual citizens. And finally, there was a notable lack of concern regarding the possibility of taxes, which, as Dania mentioned, is a very important pillar of classical, at least, rentier state theory. In the case of subsidies, so these are very specific subsidies that citizens receive, things that Dania had mentioned before, things like an education allowance, things like a social allowance, government jobs. Here we see a strong preference for, again, universal, non-excludable benefits, rather than personalistic types of subsidies that only accrue to certain citizens after meeting informal or formal criteria. Secondly, we see a very strong aversion to any type of foreign spending, not only on involvement in regional politics, but also on foreign investments, so things that are nominally at least supposed to help the state's economic situation. On the other hand, we don't see such a negative preference towards spending on defense. So there really is something about involvement in regional politics and the money that's spent on that type of military involvement versus national defense, which citizens have a distaste for. Meanwhile, and I don't show the results here, but when you ask the same question using the sorts of straightforward traditional survey questions that have historically been used to measure these things, the literature that I quickly summarized at the beginning, you find that citizens tend to say, oh yeah, we need all of that stuff. And they won't choose between competing benefits in the way that we force them to do in these experiments. And so here's a visual summary of what we found. And I should say that as of over the weekend, this paper has been published in Comparative Politics online. So it will be coming in the, I think, January 2020 issue, but there's an online preview available for those who want to check out the full paper. And so visually, we can see what I've already summarized, that there's a very strong prioritization of health and education spending. Defense, infrastructure, and social spending also have a slight positive preference, meaning that if that type of spending appears in the basket in the experiment, people are more likely to pick that basket on average. Meanwhile, international investment and culture, as well as especially involvement in regional crises, is very much deprioritized as a type of spending that people would like to see the state continue. In the case of subsidies, so these are the more specific benefits rather than sectors of state spending, we see a very similar result, that citizens tend to prioritize free education, free health insurance, free water and electricity. There's also a slight positive preference for government jobs, or a positive preference, but it's not as strong as those very core social services. Free housing and land allotment, which in the Qatar case is guaranteed to citizens, is a neutral in this experiment. And again, we see that social allowance, marriage allowances, these types of allowances which only apply to certain types of people, so not universal, are deprioritized, as well as, interestingly, no taxes. So the idea of not having taxes, at least in our experiments in Qatar, is not something that people prioritize over these other types of subsidies. And so what can we conclude about this in substantive terms? First, basic public services tend to underpin the Rentier bargain. Classical statements of the Rentier social contract acknowledge that both private goods and public goods are important, but in this case, the results seem to really emphasize the role of these basic private goods, like healthcare, education, and utilities. Whereas people recognize, we theorize in the paper, they recognize that private patronage can be lucrative, but people aren't guaranteed to receive it because of structural differences in the way that rents are allocated in states, whether it's, well, there are different dividing lines depending on the country, but it's clear that not everyone is eligible for all types of benefits, or unlikely to receive the same degree of benefits. And finally, foreign spending in particular is viewed as something that's not of direct benefit to citizens, so it's very strongly deprioritized in our experiment. The issue of taxation is interesting because of how far it cuts against the grain of standard Rentier state theory. Lack of taxation was the least prioritized Rentier subsidy in Qatar. The tax on goods and services was the most preferred austerity measure. This is a separate result that I'm not reporting here for time considerations, but we asked people essentially to pick between very specific policy measures to recover a budget. So cutting salaries, cutting subsidies, a tax on goods and services, or a cut of electricity, making people pay for electricity and water. And by far the most popular method of balancing the budget was a tax on goods and services. And finally, interestingly, it's the wealthiest citizens in Qatar, not the poorest, who are most likely to support taxation as an austerity measure. And we theorize this may be because those citizens are more confident in their ability to recoup their tax income through distribution later on. Finally, lessons for GCC fiscal reform agendas based on these findings. Outside spending on foreign aid, on foreign investment, on war is likely to come under increased public scrutiny. And I think we're already starting to see that in the case of Saudi Arabia and the Yemen war, for example. Second, states must be seen to distribute the burden of austerity equitably across society, not only between across citizens, but between elites and citizens. States must do more than they've done now to insulate poor and older citizens, because these are the people who are most likely to reject the idea of reform. There is more room to maneuver with respect to taxation than historically acknowledged in the Rentier state literature. And so this is one positive result from the standpoint of fiscal plans of Gulf states. And finally, something that isn't directly related to these results, but is sort of a parallel research project that I've published on elsewhere. One wonders whether security and good governance, especially in the context of the COVID crisis, might not emerge as new pillars of a Gulf social contract. So this is the idea that some citizens might not vary in their political attitudes toward the state as a result of economic conditions, right? So it's not that a person is relatively better off versus poorer that makes them loyal or supportive of the state. It's something else. And that something else could be the feeling of security and stability that the Gulf states have provided to citizens, especially since the Arab Spring. And now, in the case of the COVID crisis, their ability to weather this reaction to the pandemic and again, keep people secure and safe in an environment which seems increasingly uncertain. This would have very broad implications for the social contract, because it would mean that states could preserve the same level of support among citizens without spending as much money, because now they're offering citizens an intangible benefit of keeping them safe from external enemies, from internal enemies, from viruses, rather than giving them things directly. I will end there and stop sharing my screen. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions. And like I mentioned, this is a paper that's just recently been published. If you don't have access to the full text through the journal's website, I'm sure you could find the copy edited text somewhere online, or I can send it if you send me a message. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Now I'll turn to Dr. Hertog.
Great, thanks, Courtney, and thanks to GIF for organizing the event and including me. What I was planning to talk about for just a few minutes is essentially the recent fiscal measures in Saudi Arabia, how they stack up compared to previous fiscal adjustments historically, and what they tell us potentially about the malleability and the long-term adjustment of the social contract. And I think it's worth just looking at these measures because they're very, very significant. So the tripling of the value-added tax and the discontinuation of a 1,000 riyals a month public sector salary allowance that was paid to everyone in the public sector is really unprecedented cut to the state-provided wealth distribution system that has been in place for decades. So in previous episodes of austerity in the 1980s, when oil prices were low in the 1990s, in 2014-15, there was never a cut that was so targeted at households to the same extent. There were very significant cuts to capital expenditure, to some subsidies, including subsidies that benefited industrialists, but there was never a direct hit to household purchasing power on that same scale. There was one attempt to reform the public sector allowance system in 2016 under Mohammed bin Salman. That was essentially abandoned half a year later because of the very significant blowback on social media and elsewhere. And it was one of the very, very few measures where the quite risk-loving and quite ambitious leadership of Saudi Arabia that has emerged since 2015 really backpedaled. It was one of the very, very few incidents when that happened. And now they've gone for it again, now they're sticking with it. So the tripling of the VAT and the cutting of public sector allowances is going to take something like 100 billion Saudi riyals of real income out of Saudi pockets a month. So to put that into perspective, that's about a sixth or a seventh of the total salary income of all Saudi households. So it's a very, very significant hit to real incomes that will affect consumption. It will affect domestic demand and thereby the private sector, because most private demand is actually indirectly government generated through government salaries and transfers. So that there'll be externalities for broader non-oil growth also. And so far, the backlash to it seems to have been relatively muted. I mean, there was grumbling on social media, but it doesn't seem to be on the same scale, as far as I can tell, as what you had in 2016-17. Probably under the cover of COVID, with the very dramatic oil price developments as cover, and also because Mohammed bin Salman is now established quite firmly as crown prince. whereas the 2016 measures happened at a time when, at least formally, his position as the next king wasn't as consolidated. So it's a very, very significant shift. They seem to be sticking with it. There's recently been a little bit of backpedaling on new tariffs on consumer goods, but that's really secondary compared to what they've introduced. I wouldn't rule out that at some point there could be a blowback when the VAT actually gets introduced and when the full contractionary effect of that for the private sector becomes visible. But for now, it seems they're sticking with the most significant cuts to the social contract in really modern Saudi history. So does it mean kind of the end of the social contract as we know it? I think it's mostly a shrinkage. Fundamentally, most Saudi households will remain dependent on government. The majority of Saudis will remain employed by the public sector. There will be very little independent, autonomous private demand generation. It's just all happening on a lower level. It's going to happen on a level that will restrict private sector growth and that will reduce the real income of Saudis. So it's just a more modest version of what we've had before. I don't see those measures themselves ushering in sort of post-oil era in which the majority of people get private sector jobs, more income is generated privately, people become more entrepreneurial, less dependent on the government. That could happen in the very long run, but it's a multi-generational project. So if you look at where household income comes from, where demand is generated, the state is still absolutely central. So it would have to be additional, much more drastic cuts to really reshift that kind of balance. So it's kind of a harsher version, I think, of what we had before, with a marginal impact, pushing some people to seek private sector employment and private economic activity, but that indirectly is also so much dependent on state money being injected into the economy that that alternative now is also actually less attractive. If anything, it's taken a larger hit through COVID because no one's gotten dismissed in the public sector, right? Public sector jobs have been completely secure throughout the crisis, whereas in the private sector, there's at least some precariousness of employment. So in that sense, public employment has actually gained some additional attractiveness because of its ironclad nature. But they've done a lot to also preserve private sector jobs of Saudis, but still the relative precariousness has become more visible. So will there at some point be a political breaking point at which the population grumbling turns into more open political mobilization against austerity? Frankly, it's very, very difficult to tell. I don't see the signs now. I think there's a pretty high level of fear in society because of previous political crackdowns. So I think the cost of piping up has drastically increased, and that people factor that in. There's also anecdotally, I think, relatively strong performance legitimacy, not only in Saudi Arabia, but in most GCC countries, given that things are so much worse in neighboring Arab countries. So I think, the by and large pretty bleak picture after the Arab uprisings, the civil unrest in the wider region, that really plays very much to the benefit of GCC rulers and kind of strongman figures like Mohammed bin Salman in particular. And there's also some legitimacy that has come out of the social liberalization agenda, which is really the one part of the vision process that has worked pretty well. Although even there, some of what's been done costs a lot of money, right? Some of the big entertainment events, flying over golfers and having WWE and WWF wrestlers in Riyadh, that's been by and large a very big money loser because of the infrastructural costs, the security costs, the tee-off fees they had to pay to golfers, millions of dollars. So they'll also have to be much more selective in that regard. But that being said, reining in the religious police, opening up the public space, that doesn't cost money, and it has been successful by and large in the younger generation. Although again, we don't have the kind of nice hard survey data on that. I would really need to quantify it, like Justin does it so admirably with regards to fiscal policy in Qatar. But it's certainly the general sense that in the younger generation, this has been a plus, and this has boosted Mohammed bin Salman. So I think the social liberalization part of the vision agenda will become even more important because it's easier to do and it's relatively cost-free. I don't think that the non-oil diversification agenda is going to do particularly well because it still requires quite a bit of state resources, quite a bit of state money. They'll have to be much more selective in what they do in terms of the public investment fund investing in new tourism projects, new manufacturing projects, new tech projects. But that doesn't mean that with a more kind of selective state, the private sector is going to fill the void. The private sector, by and large, is an appendix of the state in the sense that the state injects money into the economy, and then the private sector picks up some of that demand. I think one very interesting question going forward will be what's going to happen to central bank reserves and to the stability of the currency, because that has very, very important distributional implications. Right now, looking at what happened the last 2 months, they seem pretty hell-bent on preserving a certain minimum reserve level. They've gone for unprecedented austerity, although now again, there's quite a bit of talk of stimulus, so they're kind of conflicting signals of introducing tax on the one hand, and on the other hand, reflating certain sectors in the economy, so we'll have to see where that moves. But in terms of what they've decided, it looks like they want to preserve reserves, they want to prioritize fiscal balance or a lower budget deficit, and that would mean a slower drawdown of central banking reserves, which would make it easier to defend the peg of the Saudi riyal to the dollar. Now, why am I talking about this? That is because so much of what's consumed in Saudi Arabia, as well as the other GCC countries, is imported, both tradable goods, but also non-tradable services that are provided by expatriates whose reservation wages are set at home. So, when the Saudi riyal devalues, the wage expectation of all those foreigners who want to send the majority, the bulk of their money home to their families, those wage expectations are going to increase. So through several channels, you'd have very significant imported inflation if there had to be a currency devaluation, both in terms of the cost of service and the cost of imported goods, which is the majority of goods consumed in the Gulf. So if, say, the central bank reserves drop below a level that is considered unsustainable, there's speculative attacks by hedge funds, and suddenly you have to devalue the Saudi riyal by 20, 30, 40%, that could be a cut to everyone's real income in Saudi Arabia of 15, 20, 25%. So there would be a huge, huge hit to, again, the social contract and the broader quality of life of both citizen residents and expatriate residents. So I think it's something we have to watch quite closely. Oman is quite close to having to devalue, although it does seem that it has some implicit guarantees from its neighbors. Bahrain would have devalued without the guarantee from its neighbors. And Saudi Arabia might be moving closer towards a level of reserves where that becomes a very live discussion again. And that would be an unprecedented test of the performance legitimacy of the leadership, because if the currency slips and suddenly everyone is 20% poorer, that is obviously not what was promised with the vision, and there would be a kind of disruption that's really unprecedented. We're not there yet, and clearly through their austerity, they've slowed down the slide towards that kind of scenario. And in 2021, oil pricing might be back to a level where they still run fiscal deficits, but actually the reserve drawdown is stanched. But it's certainly a scenario that we should keep in mind as a distinct possibility in the coming few years. So just to summarize, I do think that the social contract continues to exist, and the basic outlines that have been established over the last few decades, but it's been downsized. But it's not being replaced by something new, with a partial exception of more emphasis on national identity, stability, legitimacy, and the social opening agenda as sort of alternative basis for regime legitimacy in the Saudi context. But socioeconomically, it's still by and large, broadly speaking, the same system, just under quite a bit more fiscal strain. So I think I'll stop at that point. I'll just very quickly say that I agree with the sort of dismissal of Justin and Dania of a mechanistic taxation representation link. So a very kind of naive reading of Rentier state theory, saying that as soon as you introduce a tax, people will ask for open parliamentary elections and parliamentary control over the budget and the licensing of political parties. It's never that straightforward. There could be more political demands, more political unrest because of fiscal pressures, but not necessarily through those particular mechanisms.
Great, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to Gulf International Forum and to the Middle East Center at LSE for organizing, and to our speakers. Really appreciate all your comments, and hopefully 10 years from now, we're not still talking about the same issues. Hopefully there's been some progress. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.